Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Professor Hall, and today we have our first of two lectures about the book Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. So we're going today, as you can see from the lovely list over there, we're going to talk a little bit about the author. We'll get into some of the background of the book. What exactly is Pachinko? How does it relate to the story? A little bit of the history. This book takes place over 8 decades. It goes from around 1910 to 1989. So we'll talk about some of the history, the annexation and colonization of Korea by the Japanese, something that I think a lot of American history courses don't cover. So we'll be talking about that. We'll also talk about Christianity in Korea, the similarities and some differences to some of the other books that we're going to take a look at. We'll go over the plot and overview, at least of the first part of the book. I don't want to give you too many spoilers, but a little bit of an introduction to kind of get you started. And then we'll talk about the structure and the point of view briefly. Next time, we'll dig into some of the elements of the story a little bit more. So setting, characterization, some of the major themes, and some of the major symbols. So let's get started. Min Jin Lee was born in 1968. She was actually born in South Korea. The book, for the most part, takes place before the split happened, so before the Korean War. Much of the book takes place actually during what would be World War I and World War II, and then just after. So, at any rate, she was born in Seoul, South Korea. She came to the United States in 1976 and eventually grew up in Queens, in New York City. She later attended Yale University and also studied law at Georgetown and worked as a corporate lawyer for a number of years before becoming an author. So she has been known specifically for writing about Korean life and about Korean American life as well. Her first novel was Free Food for Millionaires, which was published in 2007, and then Pachinko 10 years later in 2017. And she's also been working as a journalist as well. So that's just a little bit about her. She's won a number of awards, the NYFA, New York Foundation for the Arts, Fellowship for Fiction. She has won a narrative prize for a new emerging writer. When she was at Yale, she was also awarded a prize for nonfiction as well as fiction. So a well-received author, and I hope that you do enjoy the book. So what exactly is Pachinko? Well, originally this book had a different name, and the author, in working with the publisher, chose the name Pachinko. It's a mechanical game that originated in Japan. So I guess the best way that I could put this for people who haven't seen it, it's a little bit like a slot machine, kind of. The old-fashioned type of Pachinko, some of your books might have this on the cover, but it had like different pins sticking out. They also use this, if you ever watched The Price is Right, and you'd put a coin in the top and it would bounce off the pins. I think in The Price is Right, they call it Plinko, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, it's an arcade game used for gambling. So it's low stakes and low strategy, and it's interesting because gambling for cash is actually illegal in Japan, but they have these pachinko parlors that kind of became widespread. So basically what happens is that people will win like prizes almost, if you can think about it, if you've been to an arcade in the States where you get like tickets and then you exchange the tickets for like little trinkets, right? Like a piece of candy, or if you get enough, maybe a stuffed bear, that kind of thing. So you win balls and they can't be exchanged exactly for money, but you can get prizes for the balls that you've won, and then you can exchange the prizes for money. So it's kind of a way of like circumventing the law. But the whole thing about pachinko is that much like a slot machine, it is based on chance, entirely by chance. And so one of the themes that we'll talk about later in this book has to do with the author looking at these characters and thinking about what role fate plays in their lives and what role chance plays. So that chance kind of comes up again and again as a theme, that things sort of seem to happen to them that are beyond their control. The other thing I will say about Pachinko is that I don't know whether this part was intentional, because I've only heard her talking about the idea of chance and fate, but I think that there is a very real idea that the house always wins, right? When you have something with gambling, and many of the people in this book are marginalized and in poverty, and it's very difficult for them to get out of that situation because the odds are kind of stacked against them in favor of the less marginalized, wealthier, more powerful characters. So we're going to talk more about that next time, but I kind of want to introduce it here. So a little bit of background about the Japanese annexation and colonization of Korea. I think that this is a little bit difficult to kind of understand, but it's extremely vitally important to the book, because in the book, we see all of these historical events from a very personal perspective. So it really has more to do with what the characters are going through. And there isn't as much comment about these larger issues around them. It's just sort of taken for granted that you will kind of know what happened. And I think that the author does that intentionally so that people will study Asian history and Korean and Japanese history and kind of dig into that further. Because as I said, much of the time in the United States, and if you're one of my Canadian students, I think that we get a lot of American history, we get a lot of Western history. We don't get as much history about Asia or Africa, countries where people look different from people from Europe, right? I think that happens much of the time. So there's a lot of these gaps in history that we might not really have information or knowledge about, but it's really fascinating. So basically what happened is this: there's a pre-colonial period, there's a pre-annexation period where Japan has become a protectorate of Korea. And essentially what you have are these ethnographers. Ethnographers are people who study ethnicity, right? And much of the time that's a troubling practice. But they're Japanese ethnographers who are studying Koreans, and they're basically saying, they're arguing in the early 1900s, so 1900 to about 1910, they're arguing that Koreans have physical, linguistic, and some cultural similarities to the Japanese, but that they also have distinct differences as well. And they kind of paint the Koreans as being less evolved, essentially. So they're saying hey, we came from the same race, but Japanese evolved quicker and more productively, and we're a more evolved race of people or an ethnic group now. And the Koreans, we have to help because they're behind us. So they basically are saying that the Koreans are ignorant, they're lazy, they're incapable of initiating progress. And this is very common in history, right? That you kind of other a group and you say that they're inferior so that you can justify taking them over or going to war with them or whatever the case may be. So, if you look at what happened in Germany a couple decades later in the 1940s, it's exactly the same tactics that are being used here. So basically, because of these beliefs, Japan has this idea that they should colonize Korea and lead them to a more evolved, civilized way of life. And so what happens essentially is that they go from being a protectorate to being annexed. Now, annexation is frowned upon and it's essentially illegal now. And what essentially happens is that one country goes into another, and because of the invading country's military prowess, there is no war. They just kind of take over. So again, if you look at Germany and Austria in World War II, something kind of similar happened. And certainly we have Russia trying to do that with the Ukraine, though of course there is a war because of that, or there was, depending on when you're watching this video. So eventually Japan annexes Korea in 1910, and they have this colonial ideology that they are going to produce knowledge in the people that they've taken over. So they start putting into place sanitary reforms because they've painted the Koreans as being dirty. Seoul, they have branded and this is a direct quote, but they branded it the shit capital. So they have all of these reforms for sanitation. They also have such big military strength that the Koreans really can't do anything about this. So the new colonial government has new economic policies, institutional policies, and they kind of give the impression that this was a peaceful takeover, that no one protested, and that's really not true. They're doing surveys of the land. So they're taking the land away from tenants. They're taking land rights away from people. There's this great economic gap between the landlords that are mostly now Japanese and the tenants. This is a colonial tactic of like dividing and ruling, right? So land ownership and commodifying the land is part of this, and also the putting down of political dissidents. So they imprison about 700 people, and most people can't fight back. The intellectuals are also trying to change. They're trying to change they're trying to change Korean culture, essentially, to be more Japanese. They have this idea that shamanism is the dominant religion in Korea, which really wasn't true. And that Shintoism, again, is this idea of evolution and more civilized, and that's the dominant religion in Japan. So essentially, throughout World War II, you have this colonialism, economic relations that are basically forcing Koreans to contribute to Japan during the war, and the poverty of both Korea and then eventually Japan because of the war. We also have the idea of comfort women. Comfort women are Korean women who were human trafficked and were raped by the Japanese soldiers during World War II. So again, poverty and economic policies, sexual labor, and the enforcement of that, all of this because you're seeing people from Korea as being other and less than, and all of that kind of thing. Eventually, the Korean national efforts come about after World War II, and the Japanese annexation ends after that period of time. So all of that is going on in the background of this book. We also have Christianity in Korea. I should be highlighting this so you guys kind of can track where we are. I talked about the annexation a little bit longer than I wanted to. Sorry about that. So Christianity in Korea is kind of interesting. You know, in some of the other books we're reading, particularly Crazy Rich Asians, Christianity or religion in those books, for most people, it's kind of an outward showing of appearance based, and it's not as authentic. The characters in this book, for the most part, religion is really important to them and their faith is really important. they're making major decisions based on their faith. And so that's something to kind of take into consideration. But Christianity essentially was imported to Korea around the 1780s. So you have some, interestingly enough, Confucian scholars who are studying different types of philosophies, and they encounter Catholic missionaries and Protestant missionaries in China, and then they bring those ideas back to Korea. For a bit of time, these missionaries were encouraged and welcomed. And then in the 1800s, the government begins to feel that they are infiltrating and causing dissent among the Korean population. So you have basically government leaders who say, well, now people have this religion. They have more allegiance to God than they do to us. And at that time, around 3 to 4% of the population would identify as Christian. So Christianity really did not grow that quickly, and especially then during the Japanese annexation, it was discouraged. And many, we're going to see in the book that some of the political prisoners are political prisoners also because of their religious beliefs and their faith. So what basically happens is that it's kind of confusing, but some scholars think that Christianity just didn't grow during that time, and that about 2 to 5% of the population would identify as Christian, but might have been kind of more secretive about it. Other people think that given the explosion of Christianity later, that a lot of people were worshiping in secret because of the Japanese annexation, because of the political powers that were controlling things at that time, so that they were meeting and worshiping in secret. Because a couple decades after World War II, this is where you really start to see many more people identifying as Catholic or Protestant, so either one of those major Christian beliefs. And by the 1990s, about 30% of the country identifies as Christian, and that's about where it is today. For South Korea, obviously for North Korea, the numbers aren't really known. But that's just a little bit of background. So what essentially is happening in the early chapters of this book, in part 1, where we are still in this Japanese annexation, is that you have people who are very passionate about their faith, and then some people who are going to be punished for that. So that's something to look for. So let's get into the plot and the structure. I kind of want to talk about both here. The structure of the book is divided basically into 3 sections. So we have book 1, which takes place 1910 to 1933. Book 2 takes place from 1939 to 1962. And then book 3 takes place from 1962 to 1989. So the first part is called Homeland, and that begins the story of, we're looking at the Baek family, Sunja, her father Huni, and it starts in Korea. So we have a little fishing village, and there's an aging fisherman and his wife, and they take in boarders or lodgers to make a little bit of money. They have 3 sons, but only one is left with them, and that is Huni. Huni has a cleft palate, so split, and also he has a twisted foot, so he limps. They didn't think that he would live, but he survived into adulthood. But basically, because of these problems, people think that he will never be married, but he decides that he wants to be married. And when Japan annexes Korea in 1910, he's 27. A lot of families become impoverished because of the annexation. And so, his family, because of the lodging and the prudence that they have with money, they're doing pretty well. So he decides to marry, and the matchmaker arranges for a match with the daughter of a poor farmer. So in the mid 1910s, they are married. They have their daughter Sunja, and after her 13th birthday, her father Huni dies. She is then pursued by a man named Hansu, who is a lodger there, and he is Japanese. So we have basically here kind of a microcosm. A microcosm is when you have a relationship or a small area like a house or a school where the relationships kind of represent the larger world. And so I really want you to pay attention to this relationship between Hansu and Sunja, because he is taking advantage of her in many different ways, and yet she's kind of captivated by him and kind of powerless to ward off his advances. So because of their affair, at the age of 16, she becomes pregnant. He wants to keep her as a mistress, and she thought that he would marry her. I don't want to get into too many of these details and spoil it, but at any rate, she's kind of not knowing what to do. She thinks she might be kicked out of her home because of the pregnancy, and she eventually comes to one of their other lodgers named Isak. Now, Isak is a Christian minister, and he's also a Korean who, for the most part, lives in Japan. But he's suffering from tuberculosis, and so he's back in Korea by the seaside trying to recover. Sunja and her mother are taking care of Isak, and he, in return, realizes her situation and wants to marry her. Again, he's really acting out of his faith, wanting to take care of someone else and that kind of thing. So part one essentially ends with the birth of Noah, Hansu's son. Hansu, temporarily at least, is out of the picture. Isak and Sunja are planning on going back to Japan, where he hopes that he can kind of give her a better life. And I don't want to get into the other two parts too much, other than to say that, you know, structurally we have part two, which looks at the family then in Japan, and then part three has Sunja's reflections, ending with Sunja's reflections about what has happened her entire life and kind of the saga of this family. So basically, you have this multi-generational story, and the point of view, for the most part, is omniscient third person. So there's a little bit of what's called head hopping, where the narrator kind of goes into different people's experiences and what they think and what they feel. I really, though, want you to pay attention to the first few chapters, because when they're talking about Huni and this little island fishing village, and especially the time before the annexation and leading up to it, and really before Sunja begins having her affair with Hansu, the way that this story is being told is much like a fairy tale. And I think that that's also intentional, that we start in what must seem like the very far distant past, and as we move forward, then we get more and more intricate characterization and dialogue and things like that. There's very little dialogue in the first chapters, and a lot of it is really just the narrator telling what happened. Again, the way that a fairy tale kind of would be told, in almost seems magical or far off. And I think partially that's intentional, because this is a Korea before the annexation that doesn't exist anymore, right? And especially before the North Korea, South Korea split in the later decades. So I think that she's trying to kind of paint this picture of what Korea was like before the colonization, before the division, and all of that. So it's a very interesting story. It's beautifully told. And when we come back next time, we'll talk more, as I said, about some of those settings, characters, and themes. Thanks, everybody.